You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Yes, welcome to the Ag Policy Connection. I'm Kelvin Hepner, and we are excited together with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute to launch this podcast, where we're going to dive into the policies, again, that shape agriculture as we know it today, how we got here, and where we're headed on the big issues affecting farming in Canada. The Ag Policy Connection can be found, of course, on Real Agriculture and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And on this episode, we are going to dive into the history of the Ag Policy Framework, commonly referred to as the APF, the big agreement between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments that's been signed roughly every 5 years, going back to 2002, when the original framework was created, covering everything from crop insurance and business risk management programs to research, market development. Much of what governments do when it comes to agriculture and farming in Canada falls under the Ag Policy Framework. What were the problems it was intended to fix? Why did the provinces and federal government get together back in the early 2000s and sign this deal? Is the framework still relevant today? And what needs to change going forward? To answer and discuss these questions, we're pleased to have a pair of panelists on this episode. We're pleased to welcome, first of all, one of the people who played a central role in that first Ag Policy Framework. Douglas Hedley was the Assistant Deputy Minister for Farm Financial Programs with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada with the Ag Department in the early 2000s. He was in the room and developed some of the policies and the fundamental pieces of the Ag Policy Framework that still stand today. Also joining us, we're pleased to have Scott Ross. I think I can call Scott a fellow ag policy nerd. He's also the executive director of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. So Scott's been involved in more of the evolution of the ag policy framework and the discussion and analysis and lobbying advocacy efforts around the APF over the last decade or so as we've gone through Growing Forward 1 and 2 and the Canadian Agriculture Partnership. As we record this conversation, we're approaching the end of the 5-year Canadian Ag Partnership, or CAP, which ran from 2018 to 2023, and we are set to begin the new SCAP, or Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership, as it's been dubbed. So we thought this would be a great time to discuss some of the big picture, why we have this ag framework in Canada, how it came to be, some of the behind-the-scenes stuff as well that happened leading up to the agreement, that original agreement in 2000, all of that. And without further ado, you're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, covering the Ag Policy Framework. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So maybe we should start with a bit of background, just quickly, each of you, where you're coming from. I know you both come from kind of different contexts when it comes to the Ag Policy Framework. Doug, you, of course, were in the room back in the early 2000s when this was created. Can you fill us in a bit on your connection to the Ag Policy Framework, where you're coming from when it comes to this discussion?
Well, I started in government in 1972. I left and came back and left and came back. And I come back in for the last time in 1988, which a year later we were starting into really a transformation in ag policy for agriculture. I stayed there until 2004, so I was there through at least the formative period in creating not only the APF, but the program platforms that came later. Started in the late 90s, but really built with the 2003 agreement.
Okay. Scott, you would have a more recent experience dealing with the APF, similar to my kind of time frame.
Yeah, I first started with the CFA in 2012, so right around the Growing Forward 2 sort of period of time, and was working as the Director of Business Risk Management and Farm Policy at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture at the time, and I've been very involved in that file, I would say, ever since that time, so for just around 11 years now, and seeing a lot of the recent policy transformations and changes that have taken place. And Otherwise, I would say I learned a lot about the history from people like Doug Hedley here in terms of what was going on prior to that. So certainly a little more recency bias, but certainly looking forward to kind of talking about the origins of the APF and how we find ourselves where we are today.
And to begin then, I should say, Scott, feel free to jump in and ask a question or comment along the way, as we're going to have Doug take us on a bit of a tour, a quick overview of the history of ag policy in Canada. And Doug, you were saying how there was a turning point, a key meeting in May of 1989. Agriculture Minister Don Mazankowski was the federal minister, and he called together federal and provincial ministers. That kind of set the stage for what later evolved into the ag policy framework in the early 2000s. But can you maybe take us through the history leading up to that point? What led to that key meeting in the late 80s, led by Minister Mazankowski?
Okay, well, let me characterize some things very quickly. If you go back into the late 1800s, we had economic and political organization that's referred to generally as laissez-faire. John Stuart Mill defined it. What it meant was governments were not involved in business, period. They didn't want to be there. Leave that dirty business to those in commerce. That began to fall apart for agriculture in 1919, whereas everybody thinks the recession began in 1929. It didn't for agriculture. It began immediately after the war, and that was because of surplus as much as anything else, abundance, if you wish. Government started bailing out some of the farm cooperatives in the West in the late 1920s. But the real shift came with the election of governments in both Canada and the US, who immediately went to something called a New Deal. It meant that government had to get involved in markets. That persisted, where governments felt they had to be into and part of markets and marketing, domestically and internationally, until really we get into the late 1980s. The interesting thing is that the shift from laissez-faire to governments in markets for agriculture took 15 to 20 years. In other words, to go from one set of economic and political approaches to another very different one, it took that long to become stable, if you wish. So when we get into the 1970s, what you find immediately is that the International Wheat Agreement began to fail in 71. And the four major exporters of wheat essentially said, no, we're not going to play the game anymore. Because prior to that, they had set quotas by importing country and maximum and minimum prices. Well, as Russia entered the grain markets in 71, it caused quite a spike in prices for a whole lot of reasons, and that's another story which we could do later. But we had the World Food Conference thinking that we were in a period of scarcity, which was false. Once we absorbed Russia into the markets, we still had an overabundance of agricultural product in the world. Prices were not very good. And what you find is that cabinets preferred to give money to agriculture than solve problems. Very clearly in the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, I mean, it was $1 billion in 85, it was $1 billion in 86. If we skipped a year and had another billion, the share of net income in agriculture coming from governments was skyrocketing. It simply couldn't go on. And I would recall that Eric Nielsen in the new Mulroney government in 84, 85 was given the task of wiping out a whole lot of what were regarded as useless subsidies.
What would some examples be there, Doug? of those subsidies?
Well, virtually everything in agriculture. I mean, including all the transportation subsidies, both east and west, whether it was crow rate or feed trade assistance, advanced payments, stabilization and subsidy programs, you name it. Well, it went to cabinet and failed miserably. So we come into 79, Maz is the new minister, and he was faced by a unending call for more money. I mean, it was weekly, if you wish. And he refused to meet with them until May of 79. And he essentially said to them, if you're here for money, the meeting's over. If you want to talk about policy, I'll be here. And it switched. There was the sense that you couldn't push back on Maz. I should be calling him Mr. Mazinkowski, but I think the whole world knows him as Maz. That started a whole set of discussions. And he essentially set out a whole new way of working in agriculture, and that is policy first, then we'll figure out what the programs are and how much they cost. I have to say from the outset that in 1989, 90, I don't think anyone, including Mr. Mazinkowski, had a clear idea of where we wanted to be in 10 years. We were struggling with it. We had a WTO, we had a GATT negotiation underway, which was tackling subsidies, export subsidies, and market price support. So we knew those were coming down the pipe. There was only one truly new program created at that time, was NISA. It was built on the belief that if farmers would put some money away, they could use it when things went badly on their farm. I'll come back to that point because NISA is a useless program. It does things and gets nothing in return. Well, Maz did something else, which most people don't realize how critical it was. And that was he created the Farm Income Protection Act. And for the very first time, he broke down the barriers that we had built for years and years of one policy for the West and one policy for the East. We had two ministers of agriculture from 1935 to the 1990s. By bringing everything into a single act, you then create the possibility of having a nationwide agricultural policy for the first time in history. That charged everyone, including the Fed proud ministers, to start looking at it. By the time we got out to 91, 92, prices were reasonably good. And we figured, well, we can survive this with less money.
And Doug, around that time, I recall there was an agreement called Growing Together, I think at the end of the 80s, that started to set out and demarcate a little bit of the sense of who was responsible for what aspect of risk as well, right? In terms of mapping out that producers being the first line of defense in terms of on-farm management with that joint governmental role, looking more at managing short-term volatility, and then really a recognition at the end of the day that there had to be that ultimate third line of defense around disaster and catastrophic risk management as well. And I'm not sure there was really a framework that was commonly understood prior to that time. Is that correct? Is that sort of your recollection of the events as well? Because I think a lot of that underpins the current agriculture policy frameworks we have today still.
I totally agree. That was written into a document that Maz put out. I was the one that came up with those three lines of defense. Much to the chagrin, I would point out from my bosses who didn't like it at all, but Maz did. So it stayed in. The point was that we limited agricultural money to $640 million federal in 1995-96 budget. We wiped out a whole list of legacy subsidies in that budget. We got rid of feed trade assistance That was a program that began in 1943 to assist in the war effort. And on 2 or 3 occasions, I've had to tell a minister that the war was over. That transformed things dramatically in terms of money. Out of that $620 million, it was shared based on farm cash receipts and 50% of subsidy payments in the province. That's how the money got distributed across Canada. Well, WTO set a whole set of rules that we had to work within. They were extremely helpful in program design. And we thought we were free because remember the 1995-96 budget that was set for agriculture and for a whole lot of other departments said you can't come back to cabinet to ask for more money. Well, hog markets fell apart in 97, 98. Didn't affect the U.S. too much because over 80% of the hogs sold in the U.S. were under contract. In Canada, none were. We had more hogs than we could kill in North America. So we had to do something. Alberta and PEI began experimenting with a new type of stabilization program. We took a very careful, long look at it and decided that it met the kind of requirements that the federal government had in dealing with net income more than gross income in agriculture. So we started that program that paid in 98, 99, and 2000. And the success of that led to the agreement in Whitehorse that we wanted to get to common cost-sharing relationships. We wanted common programs across Canada, that we had to stay within the WTO rules, understand that you have to have a background set of programs when modest or reasonable changes can be expected.
And those programs of Alberta and PEI are the underpinnings of the ADA program. That's correct? That's what you're referring to?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and my sense is too that at that time, one of the other variables that really drew attention to WTO compliance in particular is the inception of NAFTA and the changes in trade flows that created in the sense of increased countervail risk from the United States as well, right? I imagine that was a very formative element of why the focus on trade compliance gained such prominence at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, Minister Van Cleef, Lyle, faced a dilemma when the hog market went down. Recall that in 1984, the U.S. Challenged us on a countervail case and won. And the reason was it was a single commodity support. In other words, you could identify the money going to hog producers as a direct subsidy and hence affecting the U.S. market. It got to the point where the tariff that the U.S. put on was zero, but the case was still open. So if Lyle tried to put money into the hog industry in 97, 98, he'd immediately have a tariff, which meant the U.S. Treasury captured any subsidy that you would give to the hog industry. So we knew it had to be a farm-wide program. That was why we went with that program that Alberta and PEI had fairly successfully tried out.
And is that the origins of the real focus on whole farm coverage that we see today reflected in the agriculture policy framework and programs like AgriStability?
I think so. I mean, that's where the rubber hit the road, if you wish. We had been looking at wider programs for many, many years. I mean, WGSA, the Western Grain Stabilization Act, covered 17 commodities, remember, at its height. Started with a little less, but kept adding over the years. It forced us into a farm-wide program. We probably would have taken a little longer to get there, but all of the background led us to the belief of whole farm programming.
Doug, would that also have been a move towards less of an ad hoc approach to to offering programming, such as the response to the downturn in the hog market?
Let's put it this way. No matter what sorts of programs you put in place that are whole farm based, events are going to happen that really cannot cover the recovery costs. Floods on the Assiniboine and Red Rivers are an example. BSE is another example. I mean, we spent $4.5 billion in five or 6 years because of BSE. No amount of you could not design a program on a whole farm basis year after year that could deal with that. So you still have to look out for those sorts of events.
Getting to that 2003 timeframe, then, when the ag policy framework was first established, Doug, would you say that business risk management was the main driver of why the provinces and the federal government got together and made that agreement? Because there are other components under the APF. There's research funding and so on that also falls under the framework. But BRM, would that have been the main driver back in the early 2000s?
Yes, but I'd modify that a little bit. Even in the APF in 2000, it envisaged there were more pieces to it than simply stabilization programs. But the difference was that as you come through the 70s and 80s, 95% of the meetings of FedProv ministers was about money. That began to change with the APF in 2000. And the moment you had programs that you'd agreed to that had been worked out with officials ad nauseum, I would point out, then it freed up ministers' time to think about policy areas far beyond stabilization. And it was research and marketing, a whole range of things. And as a result, you had the time with ministers and the creativity of ministers, other than, can we have more money? That was a signal change.
And at the time, I mean, looking back, my understanding was producers were somewhat reticent with this direction at the time, in that there was a concern, I think, to your point earlier, that when those issues arose that required ad hoc responses or those black swan events that you couldn't predict, that this would make it that much more difficult to really ensure responsivity. Is that your recollection of kind of the dynamics with the producer community at the time?
Yes, no question about that. It was not easy sledding throughout that period with the farm groups. How should I say? They needed proof over time to build confidence in what those programs could do. Clearly, the experience out of Alberta and PEI was signal in starting to help producers understand where we were going and where we could go. But we've added a whole lot of things to ministers' agendas that weren't there in 2000.
So going back to that time again, Doug, who would the players have been, and were all the provinces on board, or were there some that were reluctant and had to be convinced? What was that scene or the discussion around the table at that time?
That's a curious piece of politics. There's no question that all 10 federal provincial ministers bought into the APF and the subsequent programming in 2003. Even though many of them went home and got sharply criticized by their own cabinets for agreeing with the federal government on it. They put some of their political lives on the line to get that agreement. We all knew it. We worked with them on it in the arguments that needed to be made. So no, it was not easy for them to go home after signing the agreements.
So that ADA program had been offered in Alberta and PEI. Of course, there's so many different regional and geographic and all the different priorities across the country. Quebec often has a unique view on things versus what Alberta and Saskatchewan do. BC has its own version of agriculture in Canada, and Ontario, of course, being a major economic driver across the country when it comes to agriculture. What were the differences at that time between the provinces, and how did those differences get navigated at that time?
The basic discussion we had is about risk. How do you offset risk? Risk differs not only between provinces for farmers, but between farms in the same province. But if you're going to buy some of that risk, then you will have farmers who will also take riskier decisions and others with less risky decisions. But in the middle, you're going to capture them. If you look at it from a risk perspective, as opposed to a money perspective or a design perspective only, you miss how that program can work. And it still works today that way.
Well, just on that front too, I called Doug around that time. I mean, obviously I don't recall it personally, but there was a greater flexibility, I think, within the early framework around support for companion programs at a provincial level. Is that correct? And that the federal government was able, in some respects, through maintaining a 60-40 cost share, to devote some funds to provincial companion programs to address some of that regional variation as well.
The companion programs essentially grew out of the fixed budget in the 95-96 budget. Federal money was allocated to the provinces based on farm cash receipts and 50% of the subsidies. What that meant was that if they wanted to, they could further subsidize their crop insurance, or they could run experimental programs. A number of programs that were run for a while were essentially that. Provinces could deal specifically with issues within their own provinces with that money. Some used it to subsidize existing programs, crop insurance in particular, which led to different cost shares across programs. And one of the hard agreements we got was that over a 3-year period, all provinces would bring crop insurance into a 60-40 relationship. 60% paid by government, 40% by producers, and of the 60%, 60% would be, of that 60 would be paid by the federal government and 40% by the provincial governments. And we got it.
That was in 2003, Doug?
It had to be complete by 2002 or 2003, and I've forgotten exactly the year.
I think the framework agreement was in 2002 at the time, with I think the programmatic agreement following after.
Yes, that's right.
Where did the 60-40 ratio split come from?
I've been asked that question many times, and there is absolutely no basis for it. There is no economics to it. The best it was a political saw-off over many years.
And it still exists, still stands to this day when we talk about agri-stability.
It's fairly secret today, I would say. Sorry to cut you off there,
exactly.
Colin, but I get the sense that the 60-40 is very much a fundamental, unwavering element of all the agriculture policy frameworks that have followed.
It's a very large concrete pillar, which not many people are going to be able to move. But there is no basis for it.
Interesting.
I mean, at one point, we were faced with a request federally, internally, to move it to 50-50. How should I say? All it did was generate a lot of laughter because we knew it wasn't going to happen.
Well, and I can attest to the reality today that is still a very hard to move line. You know, I think that same concrete pillar exists today and is still very much viewed in the same light.
Along those lines, Scott, when it comes to the structure that we have today, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, the new SCAP, Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership is being rolled out. We've seen some aspects evolve, but a lot of what Doug is talking about still stands when it comes to ag policy here in the 2020s. Yeah,
I think, in the reality is with the Farm Income Protection Act, is we really that was the origins, I think, of a more principle-based approach to policy. And the first agriculture policy framework was very much focused on the principles underpinning the programs. And I think in many respects, it focused on the how of policy development at the time. And what we've seen, I think, in successive agreements is more of a focus on the programmatic agreement side of it. I don't really think since the origins of the APF, there's been that same fundamental review of the how of policy development. In many respects, I think there's a bit of inertia from policy framework to policy framework and there's benefit to that to some extent of stability. But it's our experience in the recent years has been we're much more talking about programmatic agreements these days when we renew the policy framework versus really fundamentally reassessing the policy framework itself.
Do you see that as well, Doug? Should it be called the Ag Program Framework these days?
There's no question in my mind that for agriculture, you need a long-term set of programs like agri-stability in the background. Otherwise, you're going to be beset with requests for money all the time, which is not helpful when they go to one province and not another. And that really is the issue. In other words, the programs are demand-driven. They're not driven by politics. In that sense, I think there's lots of room for moving that program forward, continuing with it. You can toy with the edges of it if you wish, but unless you can identify a problem in it, then why fiddle with it? I start from a very simple notion. There's three things you got to worry about when you're thinking about ag policy. Number one is strategic policy. Where on earth are we going? What's the world look like that we have to live in? And then you go to strategic programming. That's the kind of thing you get from agri-stability and the recognition that you have to supplement it from time to time. There's no question. And third is you have to build platforms for your policy, for your programs. An example was that we built a platform throughout the 1990s. When we got into BSE, we had it was the 21st or 22nd of May, 2003. The problem was that we were going to have cows going in a hole in the ground because they couldn't afford to feed them unless we got some cash to farmers. 4 weeks after that BSE was found, we were paying money to farmers. We had a platform that allowed us to do it. We knew how many cattle were on that farm 6 months earlier. But that program ran from mid-June until about the 10th of September that year. But it staved off a problem. It gave us some time to work out what else we needed in BSE.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that platform, then you can't get money to farmers. You got to have them write in and say, this is my situation, therefore I have, can I get a payment? Well, that's 6 months. I mean, we were going to lose part of the herd with holes in the ground, probably illegally, if we couldn't move quickly. That's why I say the three things you have to have. One is strategic policy, one is strategic programming, and one is platforms to deliver. And we have that, we built it, we've renewed it. Those are the three things that to me have to make up part of ag policy.
Yeah. Scott, as we look at the new framework, the federal government has integrated some more climate focused targets and aspects to it. What do you see the APF, this framework, looking like going forward in the longer term, Scott?
Yeah, I will say, in my time at the CFA, I think what I have seen, if there were a shift underfoot, it's been greater investment into the strategic initiatives side of the framework. So in 2013, there was a very conscious effort to scale back BRM and reinvest those funds into what we call the strategic initiatives, which are everything from your market development work, research, environmental programming as an example. And I think the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership is certainly furthering that with a greater investment on the environmental side. I will say we've been encouraged to see some reinvestment back into BRM. I do think, though, in just touching on what Doug was speaking about the benefits of that stable platform, I think where we have seen, I would say, from a producer perspective, some challenges is the ability to make sure that the underlying principles stay current to evolutions in the global context. In particular, I think the last few years we've seen a real shift in global trade dynamics in particular. And one of the concerns we hear regularly from producers is that we need to be a little more granular in our discussions about trade risk and countervail, and ensuring that we're looking at these programs very much with those risks at the fore, but not necessarily holding elements of those sacred when there are really fundamental shifts in the existence or level to which we see major trading partners adhering to rules-based trade. I also think, one of the dynamics that we've really seen a shift in, given the increasing commodity prices, has been in BRM specifically, how much of that budget is now dedicated to crop insurance in particular. And it does have some equity considerations that come to the fore, given that there's still concerns amongst many sectors that don't have access to production insurance about what that means in terms of the level of support. So I think, there's definitely value in stability. At the same time, I think there's a need to take a step back and really look at those principles occasionally and reassess how they're being applied in the programming agreements that follow. And I do think that what you see with the new framework is a very clear signal of one of the dynamics that is really changing the landscape. And it is the prominence of environmental sustainability in all aspects of agricultural policy. And I think it touches on one other element of why I talk about it as a programmatic agreement more than policy, is that one of the things we're experiencing very much is that many of the levers that are critical to agriculture policy today fall outside the Department of Agriculture. ECCC, Environment Climate Change Canada, are major players in agro-environmental programming these days. And I think, when we talk about a policy framework for this sector, there's a sense of a need for vision, and that it drives policy making in the agricultural space in general. And I think that is one of the concerns that we certainly have, is that sense of what's in scope of the policy framework versus what is outside of it, and ensuring there is policy coherence there and how those programs are developed. So I do think the SCAP framework is inserting a greater focus on the environment, but there's also a lot of other policies and programs in the federal and provincial government spheres touching in these areas. And I think that is going to be a challenge moving forward in terms of how we ensure a coherent policy framework in that space in particular.
Yeah, that's some excellent points there, Scott. And curious what that potentially looks like. Does the Ag Minister become more of a contact for other cabinet ministers, and that role become more of a intermediary when it comes to reflecting this policy and making sure it is coherent with what other departments are doing?
I think in the reality on the ground is some of that is certainly taking place, is that there is a function the Agriculture Department and the Ag Minister plays in communicating and being a conduit of information to other ministries working in these spaces. I do also think when it comes to the framework, there's, reality comes to bear on what's possible in this space. And while we would very much welcome a whole of government approach and vision to these issues, we understand it is a FedProv agreement between the ministers of agriculture, and there's only so much that can be done in that space. But you did see that, I think, starting to emerge in the early 2010s with all of the national food strategy work and elements of that, where there's, I think, a conscious recognition that ag policy is getting larger in terms of the elements that are affected. We work a lot on, issues of labor, environmental concerns, other areas, transportation infrastructure that span well outside what the original policy framework was envisioning. And I think there is still some tension there, but I don't know that there's an easy fix to that. I think it's ultimately just one of those kind of looming dynamics that I think brings to question, do we need to sort of take a step back and look at some of the principles underpinning policy development and how we make sure that there is a little more coherence where possible in that. But I'm not going to say that's a simple fix overnight. I think it's very much a very complicated set of issues.
Yeah.
Scott, I agree very much with your assessment. One of the things we have to remember, and it's why I started on this today, is that we have gone from abundance to scarcity. We've never designed policy other than for abundance. we're now into a world of scarcity. We're also in a world where we do not have the protection of WTO. We stand risks from the larger economies in the export market. We have very different pricing systems around the world today. Brazil is now a very large exporter of corn and soybeans, superseding that of the US, for heaven's sakes, at a price that the US can't get in the market. So we no longer have that integration of prices around the world for agriculture and food products. That is a set of risks that are new to Canada. Those began 3, 4, 5 years ago, but between scarcity and the lack of coherent markets governed by WTO, we face a whole lot of new risks. One other thing I'd point out is that the productivity growth rate in agriculture is declining. In other words, it's not growing as fast as it used to.
Not only in agriculture, the whole economy, but yes, in agriculture as well.
But remember, we're in a period of scarcity. You cannot bring enough land into production to prevent lower and lower stocks at year end. They've been declining for some time. What that says is you're consuming more than you're producing. Well, if our productivity growth rate is declining, then we're in for really a great deal more scarcity than what we have had. But we also have policy-induced scarcity. Recall that when you look at your supplies of rice and corn in the world, a very high share of year-end supplies sit inside China, which means that in the open markets of the world, there's a very, very small amount that can be moved around.
And I'll just add to that, another facet of scarcity we're seeing now and very recently is input scarcity, is a new dynamic that I don't think has been an existing element to our policy in the past, is that we are now operating in a world where, access to crop protectants, access to fertilizer, given the conflict in Ukraine and global supply chain disruptions, there's not that same abundance and availability in Eastern Canada. Saw that very much in real time this past year. And I think it's something that is not unique to that dynamic. It's something that is a new pervasive issue that we need to be contending with as a country that is, a significant producer of nitrogen fertilizer. But at the same time, the economics of shipping that from west to east and the infrastructure that exists is not conducive to self-sufficiency there. So it's another challenge I think we really need to be grappling with in real time.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. How should I say that issue of nitrogen fertilizer is concerning because the West has it, East has to import. And it's starting to break apart, this East-West again, which sits there under the surface no matter how you deal with agriculture.
Yeah.
We had 100 years or more of it. It's baked into the system. And overcoming it is critical. But I'd come back to the point, everyone argues for more research. What I would argue is that, yes, we need that, but Canada can't do all the research it needs to work with the International Institutes of Agriculture, with the major countries involved in agricultural research, Embrapa in Brazil, for example, Wageningen in the Netherlands. We're not putting enough money into that to get the value out of it. The journals are not sufficient to bring new ideas and new research to light. That's not what journals are for. Journals are for tenure track people at universities.
Well,
That's
and I will say,
purpose.
We've seen that reflected in an increased call again for extension and knowledge transfer. I think KTT is gaining prominence again as a concern, in that there's that application of research, applied research at the farm level, and how we get knowledge from these diverse sources to the farm gate so that we can actually leverage what is out there and make sure it is practical and pragmatic in a Canadian context. I think there's a real increased focus we're hearing across the country on, concern with what we've lost in the absence of a formal extension services or a greater focus on KTT. And I think that has bearing on the policy framework discussions moving forward as well.
Yeah.
We're all coming down here to the same set of conclusions that once you get into scarcity and no WTO protection, you're into a mad world out there. And my early observation that it takes 10 to 15 or 15 to 20 years to shift from one economic and political and philosophical approach to policy, we've just started into this one. We've had at best 5 or 6 years. So maybe we'll be back to much more stable policy by 2040. I mean, that's the risk here, because we're into so many different risks today than what we had even 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I could listen to both of you go back and forth here for a much longer time, but I think that's a good place to wrap up this discussion, as we've highlighted some of the challenges and issues that we're dealing with today, as well as improving our understanding of the history, thanks to Doug, of how we have this framework in place that we now know as the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, previously the Ag Policy Framework. And so with that, thank you both for your vast insight and knowledge and sharing it. And it's valuable information for me, and I hope our listeners as well, in terms of understanding where we're at today in Canadian agricultural policies. So with that, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Scott, for your time.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
For the opportunity.
Certainly lots to learn and think about when it comes to the history and also the future of the ag policy framework here in Canada. It's an honor to have Mr. Hedley, as you can tell, an encyclopedia of ag policy knowledge and insight. And certainly it's an honor to have him join us and share some of those stories from the past. And also thanks to Scott Ross of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture for his thoughts on where we're at today and what issues might need to be dealt with in the future when it comes to a new direction and changes that need to be made or should be made. Thanks to the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute for partnering with us at Real Agriculture on this podcast series. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ag Policy Connection.